Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
So today I thought that we would talk about something that's completely unusual. We haven't really tackled these kinds of stories before. We usually stick to locations or very specific things, but this one really piqued my interest, and it's Jeff the Talking Mongoose. So before I brought this up, did you guys ever hear about Jeff the Talking Mongoose?
No.
I had not, no.
Oh, this one eludes me.
It's such a fun story, in a very odd, unusual, weird way that we love. But it sort of takes place in the 1930s. And what it is, just in a nutshell, so that our listeners and viewers, get the crux of it before we sort of start picking it apart and talking about it, is that it's the story of a talking mongoose on the Isle of Man. So mongoose are not natural to that environment. It's perhaps a mongoose somebody brought back with them from India or somewhere as a pet. It got loose. It's perceivable, yes. 1930s, people brought exotic pets home. But the interesting thing about this is that it's a talking mongoose. So a little unusual.
I see Ian's face.
It's a talking mongoose. And the story is quite intriguing because it's in a location that they're not in a city, they're not in a town, they're on a farm, they're in the outskirts. And it was first brought to the attention of a gentleman by the name of Richard St. Lambert. And he was a paranormal investigator, editor, technically, of a paper called The Listener. And he and Harry Price, who was the investigator, decided to delve into this story that had, become hot and do a little research of their own. And interestingly enough, Harry Price actually went to the island to investigate. So he's not from the Isle of Man, and he decided to go there and visit and see this family and find out about this talking mongoose. So I don't know if you guys, did you have any time to actually look into the story?
A little bit.
No.
A little bit? Okay.
I mean, I know a little bit.
Okay.
Not really.
So what I want to do is before we kick off, I want to make sure everybody is aware of this. So I'm going to read a little bit because while I know it,
Okay.
I just want to sort of read the intro so people are familiar. So the editor of The Listener, Richard St. Lambert, and his friend, paranormal investigator Harry Price, went to the Isle of Man to investigate the case and produced a book called The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. So this was after they had been there. They avoided saying that they believed the story, but were careful to report it very objectively. So that's an interesting thing to look at because sometimes people are very one way or the other, right? They don't have an objective opinion about a talking mongoose.
I bet they do, but it might not be a good one.
But that being said, the book reports how a hair was found from the alleged mongoose, and it was sent to a gentleman by the name of Julian Huxley, who then sent it to naturalist F. Martin Duncan, who identified it as a dog hair. So it was not necessarily a mongoose hair. But Price suspected that the hair belonged to Irving's sheepdog. So the story gets even more crazy because then Price asks another gentleman, Richard Pocock of the Natural Museum of History, to evaluate paw prints allegedly made by Jeff in plasticine. And they took an impression of his tooth marks as well. So Pocock could not match them to any known animal that he was familiar with and conceded that they might be a dog, but he wasn't 100% certain. He did state that none of the markings had been made by a mongoose, however. So the diaries of James Irving, along with reports of the case, are in Harry Price's archives in the Senate House Library in London, England. So it begins to spin from this initial investigation and book. And then from there, we have Price observing the Irvings at home. So he visits, as it's mentioned, and he notices that double walls of wood paneling are covering the interior rooms of the house. And it's an old stone farmhouse. So does this seem suspicious? There's 2 layers of paneling. Do any of you think that might be suspicious?
Oh, definitely.
Do you? See, I don't.
For sure.
Because it's an old stone farmhouse. And if they put up 1 layer of paneling, they didn't have insulation. So they could have set up another layer of paneling several inches apart to create an air pocket so that that's a form of insulation. So I don't find that so weird, right?
That makes sense. That makes sense in terms of, the insulation for the farmhouse.
Right.
But what that also creates is you've now got the space going through the house that it's kind of like what would be at the Winchester Mystery House when they had the little servants' microphones.
That's right.
That if you were in the kitchen, you could speak over to the
another room.
How cool is that?
Or something. So these panels with the spaces, that also created a kind of a built-in microphone for this house that if you spoke into it, you would hear a voice somewhere else in this building.
Certainly, and that is 100% true.
In Torabi, in England, it's a really old place, and they have servants' quarters, and they actually have ringing bells.
Right,
and apparently, that's obviously how they used to communicate, through the use of a bell to the servants' quarters. And these bells have been known to go off by themselves.
Well, this is interesting, right? Because what's happening in this story is that the mongoose, and for people that may not know what a mongoose is, just think of a weasel. It's very similar to
a ferret.
Like a ferret, but bigger.
Yeah.
But it has been able to make its way through the walls as well, because once they get in there, they're able to move around freely. They're small enough that they could go between. So this was sort of the idea. So upon visiting the Irvings, Price had noted that these double walls existed, and it also had a considerable interior airspace between the wood and the stone. So again, to me, that's sort of very old school way to insulate a home. But it also made the whole house, as Ian said, a speaking tube. So you could speak through and it would carry across the house. So those are some interesting things, right? So now this family...
Acoustics is so important in a home.
Has kids. And the daughter, this is where it gets really interesting. The daughter is said to be a ventriloquist.
What an amazing coincidence.
So we have this young girl who's a ventriloquist, supposedly, because there really isn't a whole lot of proof about this, but supposedly when Nandor Fodor, I can't speak today, Nandor Fodor, went there, he interviewed the girl and he got her to do some of her ventriloquism and throwing her voice. Apparently, she could also throw her voice. But he was not convinced that the voice that he heard, because he heard Jeff, he didn't believe it was her per se.
Oh.
So he was a little bit baffled by this whole story. And so Fodor disbelieved any deliberate deception had occurred. So when he went there and spent time with the family and, studied and did what he did, he was with the psychoanalytical research, the International Institute of, and so he spent a week there. He didn't find anything odd or unusual. Like I said, he spent time with the girl. She did some of her ventriloquism. She tried to teach him how to throw his voice and do all these things. So it seems very coincidental. Yes, we have a Jeff, the talking mongoose, and we have a young girl who's a budding ventriloquist. Now, the thing is that
does correlation make causation? That's where I'm going here.
Does it, right? Well, the interesting part is that there's this sort of psychological theory to explain Jeff based on what is known as a split off personality. So did the daughter have a split personality? Was she able to create this? Because the voice of Jeff was said to be masculine in nature. So it wasn't a high-pitched squeak. It was like a man's voice. So could she produce this voice with her own vocal ability and be convincing enough that the family and other people who visited didn't realize that it was her? It's an interesting question. So, Ian, what do you think about that? Because you're sort of sitting there going,
I can see the beard rub.
I can see that happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I said. This story is very unusual.
We know that. Okay, taking example of a mongoose, right, or any other animal, we know that animals have spirit energy just as we do.
Exactly.
As we discussed on one of our recent previous shows. So if you haven't already seen that, go and watch it.
Yes, definitely.
So it's plausible that a animal could actually become possessed, just like people can be, because you've got that spirit energy interaction.
Right.
But to think that this possessed mongoose is suddenly going to have the ability to speak English is
well,
and the fact that these parapsychologists from the era went in and did their investigations and could come up with no plausible evidence.
Right, exactly.
I have to say that, this whole thing was a hoax.
You think it was a hoax?
I think it was.
My glasses so that I can see better.
Oh, I like the glasses. Very sophisticated.
It just means I can read. And you and a lot of other people probably feel the same way. And it's interesting because the story sort of goes on that after these investigators were there, these psychic investigators, they actually thought Jeff was a poltergeist as opposed to a mongoose, I guess.
Can I just add to that? With demonic, when people claim to be possessed, or even if you've seen the movie, The Exorcist, they have a lower, deeper, tend to have deeper voices, or voices that aren't so far off their own that it's unrecognizable. So
Certainly,
there's that possibility.
but this is true. But this girl is not possessed, right? She's
Right,
not exhibiting any of
right.
these signs of that
And that's
type of possession. And when she's speaking, her mouth
yeah.
is not moving.
No,
So
it just, I think it might be a hoax.
it
I feel like we have such little evidence. It's hard to
again, though, it's one of those things where there's many times that there's almost no evidence to
yes.
prove, that paranormal anything exists. But what it is, again, is the reality. And whose reality? Because Rachel, you and I are both mediums, and
Psychics,
we
yeah.
hear the things that other people do not hear, but other people would say that that's not real and it's not true,
Right.
and that you're
That's
just
right.
making it up. But reality is what you know in your life, right? That is your reality. My reality is not Ian's reality, is not Rachel's reality, is not the next person's reality. Does
Yes.
that make it untrue just because someone else doesn't experience those things?
That's true.
Right?
You make a good point there.
I mean, you could say, oh, that person's mentally ill. Are they really? No. It's just their perception.
I don't get any
reality.
mentally ill vibes from this. Do you,
No,
Seeker?
no, I don't. I
know.
don't. But it's interesting because over the years, as this progressed and more people became interested in it, and the story traveled because it does.
Yeah. Just a small
There were other people that came to sort of challenge and check out the mongoose. But it's sort of the reception of this story at the time. It's a bit like the fairies. Remember in the 1950s
Yeah,
with the
I
fairies
remember that.
and the photographs of the fairies, and how that really gripped everybody's fascination, that there were fairies in the woodlands that these little girls were having conversations with, etc. Now that did turn
And
out
they were
to
so
be,
convincing at the time
they were
with the photography. They were ahead of their
definitely.
time, I think, with the photography. Yeah.
That's right. And so, but people did believe that. So with Jeff the Mongoose, I just find that, here's the story sort of in a nutshell, right? What they told the reporters, what they told people was that they could hear the voice coming through these little holes that were in the wall. So there was a couple of holes, as Ian had mentioned, in locations around the house. And every once in a while, you would hear this voice come out of the hole and say something. And it would be directed at not just the girl, but other people in the household. So when Fodor was there, he actually sat with the girl and he could hear this voice coming from the wall. So it's an interesting, in terms of that. Yes, it wasn't just that he went there and randomly, he was actually sitting with her in her room and getting her to go through the ventriloquism with him and throwing her voice,
Right.
and doing all these things. So there is that. There is the small, story that accompanies Fodor, that he could hear her speaking, but the mongoose was speaking from the wall. So is it
Now,
just
regardless of which side of the story you tend to believe,
right?
the family kind of went public
They did.
with this
Oh, I see.
this story.
Mhm.
What would they achieve out of that?
I guess
Was it a situation where they hoped they would get rich and famous?
Maybe. I mean, that's a possibility. This is 1935, 1936, right? We're in between two world wars.
Possible that there was a voice in the wall, but it wasn't a mongoose.
I'm still intrigued about how the mongoose got there to begin with, if there was indeed
Is the
a
mongoose a guise to other things?
Well, it's weird, right? I mean, it's an interesting story, but I mean, it did originate with the daughter, and I believe her name was Viore, and it's almost a bit to me like the Fox sisters. where the Fox sisters were the young girls who were, hearing the rapping, the tapping, this, ethereal,
setting it all up.
And setting it all up. And yet it was definitely a hoax in their case. But I find it interesting that so many people are still enamored with the Fox sisters in terms of believing that they had some kind of, abilities, and they did not. Right? They did not have any mediumship or psychic abilities, or if they did, they certainly did not show it. And it was found to be that most of their, automatic writing, all of these things were just pranks set up to fool people. So this is
it's a shame because they discredit everybody else, if you know what I mean. Like, they make the rest of us look bad.
But the weird thing is that, it's just one story in hundreds where these kinds of things took place, especially in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And as I said, this story takes place on the Isle of Man, not exactly the booming metropolis. And it's also between two world wars. So people were struggling a lot, likely
and no
in their
TV.
Lives, right? Well,
no TV, really.
I don't even
they have radio, I'm sure, maybe, but yeah.
But I think, Ian, you probably hit something there where it was like they were hoping that they would get famous and perhaps, be paid money to tell their stories and have people come and investigate and do all these things and in some way enrich their lives. And I can see that would make complete sense for, this family living on a farm on the Isle of Man with, not a lot going on in their lives. But what I do want to sort of catch up on here too is that the Irving family, some people believe they did collude to perpetrate this, right? They do believe that they did this. The father actually tried to convince Fodor when he was there that the sound actually came from somewhere else. So it wasn't coming from her. It was, she could throw her voice. It was coming from some other place, some other location in the house, some other sort of ethereal, voice that was speaking out. And so Joe Nickel, who was one of the researchers, he suspected the girl had used the ventriloquism and other tricks. Now, there was no proof that she actually did. So I find it interesting because if you watch the movie, and for folks who are out there who are interested in this story, there is a movie. Simon Pegg plays Nandor Fodor, who is the psycholytical analyst who comes to the island and spends a week with the family. The end of the film is very interesting, and I don't really want to give it away if you're going to watch it, but there's sort of one of those conclusions where there's no conclusion, right? No one was able to prove that the daughter was actually doing any of this. Now, when the family left the house, I don't know. When new people, came forward, perhaps moving into the home, was Jeff still there? There's some weird stories that I came across that say that yes, indeed, the mongoose was still present in the house. Although nobody really ever saw the mongoose outside of Fodor thought he saw it on a fence post outside when he was leaving.
Well, I was reading that when the family did decide to try to sell the house,
right,
they had a very hard time.
They did.
Because at that point, the house had a reputation of being haunted.
Haunted, yes. And see, this is the interesting part of the story, is that when we talk about it, it sounds kind of silly and fake and made up. And, was Jeff just a figment of the daughter's imagination? Was she using ventriloquism? Was she trying to trick her family? What was the purpose of her using this, within her own family? She was a young girl. I don't think that she was aware that the family might be able to make a lot of money off of this. But then her father seems to come on board, and this is where it sort of starts to generate outwards.
Oh.
And so the question is here, is it really a paranormal situation that the young girl was a party to because perhaps her age, and as we know, a lot of times, young people and children are susceptible to these things more so than an adult.
Yes,
and they also hear and see more often than an adult might. Or is it that she had this ability? Because in the film they do let us see that she has the ability. So that's clearly there. But I don't know. I mean, I like to think Jeff was an actual talking mongoose spirit that perhaps was in the house, but was he really a mongoose of all things? Maybe it was a weasel and people just thought it was a mongoose. I mean, it's
if no one really saw the mongoose, if it claimed to come from the walls, that could be anything. I mean, someone saying, "Oh, I thought I saw it outside." Well, that anyone can say that, Oh,
they can, but then again, remember,
I saw a squirrel outside and it talked to me.
This is not just anyone. This is Fodor, the investigator, who's a psychoanalytical researcher. So he came with a very, I guess I want to say he came with a open mind to a degree, but I don't think that he believed the story when he came there, but he was intrigued by the story. And I think for him, it was about the girl more than it was about the mongoose, right? Because he's looking at psychological issues and, traumas and perhaps mental illness and different things that people might experience. And I think that that's where he was going when he first arrived, was to see if this was indeed something along those lines. But by the end of it, he's not convinced of that, nor is he convinced that it's not potentially paranormal in nature. So when he sees the mongoose, I don't think that he is, thinking he saw it. He legitimately believes he saw the mongoose on the fence rail. So was he influenced that much by his week with the family to suddenly think that he saw the mongoose?
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.